Aaron. Please join me and Dr. Sogan in welcoming our next keynote speaker to the stage, Mr. Brody Bolin. Brody Bolin is a partner with McKinsey & Company, leading the firm's sustainability work in the built environment. He serves investors, government, technology firms, and other clients on both decarbonization and climate adaptation. He has led decarbonization efforts addressing greater than 20 megatons annual CO2 emissions across $1 trillion in real estate assets. Other recent work includes establishing a large fund investing in critical clean technologies, leading one of the first climate stress tests of a major financial institution, and developing climate adaptation strategies for cities. Brody also leads research and publishes extensively on these topics, and is an adjunct faculty at Georgetown University's Madonna School of Business. Please welcome Brody Bolin.
Hi. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very aware in this conversation that I'm speaking to a bunch of the experts. I'm just gonna do this. Does that work? I'm very aware in this conversation that I'm speaking to a bunch of the experts in the field. And so the objective that I'm kind of setting for myself, and hopefully this works for you all, is to bring a bit of the kind of view from the investment committee. Right, so I spend a lot of my time with major investors, think pension funds, private equity funds, the folks that are the, banks, the folks that are the kind of capital sources for a lot of what gets built in infrastructure and buildings. And so just wanted to share a little bit about the kind of conversations that are happening in those rooms. Does that sound good? Awesome. Okay, so first, this some of you may know this story already, but I remember hearing this in like a philosophy class in undergrad. And hopefully there may be, if there's any Greek people in the room, you can correct my pronunciation, but Thales of Miletus, I think. And the story is that, Thales was, he's a philosopher, contemporary of Aristotle. The story actually comes from Aristotle's Politics. And Thales was, in a time when a whole bunch of people around him were saying, why are you wasting your time doing all this philosophy and science kind of useless crap? And he's walking around in his toga or whatever it is, and he's trying to convince people that there's value of philosophy and value of science, and he's starts telling people, hey, I've we'll see, this may be apocryphal, but I've looked at the stars, I've looked at the astronomical kind of projections, and I think there's going to be a bumper olive crop next year. And everyone's like, crazy Thales, like, here he goes with his philosophy again. He's like, no, seriously, there's going to be a bumper olive crop next year. And they're like, what a nut job. And he's like, fine, screw it. And so what he does is he takes out, I guess, like an option on all of the olive presses in town. And sure enough, there's a bumper olive crop next year, and he makes a killing, right? And I think that's kind of where we're at in the climate discussion, right? There are a lot of people who might say, who might kind of ignore the science of it, but there are people who look at the science, straight in the face of it, who consider the detailed implications, who are aware of the uncertainties, of course, are aware of the complexities, but are understanding the opportunity that comes from that, right? And that's kind of what I think the smart investor today is doing. So, we know the weather's changing now, and one of two things are gonna happen. We're either gonna have one of the most profound economic dislocations in economic history, right, with entire industries growing and dying, with the subsectors and the spatial footprint associated with those industries growing and dying, or we're going to have, all of the natural systems that sustain human societies go through their own profound disruptions. And the reality is it's somewhere in between, right, or it's some mix of both. We're already seeing both of these things happen. You know, we're already seeing major economic shifts, and we're already seeing major, you know, shifts in the physical systems. And so I think that's what smart investors are keeping in mind, right? Smart folks in this, smart players in this built environment space are keeping that in mind. A few things that I'll go through, and I'll click through these like relatively quickly, but just it's going to be a bit of a view of risk and resilience, and then a view of decarbonization. On the risk resilient side, main messages: risks are meaningful, they're unevenly distributed. I know I'm very aware that I'm speaking to a lot of folks who actually like do this modeling work, so I will, you know, try and present it with all humility. And smart investors are taking that into consideration, right? Like they're being the Thales of Miletus, right? And they're factoring that into how they invest. And then on the decarbonization side, decarbonization can be profitable or not, right? And you know, to make the economics work, there are some things that we can do that are within our agency that allow decarbonization to be profitable. And then I'll close with a bit of a view of, you know, a bit of like a systems view of what are some of the things, at least in my opinion, that we need to do to accelerate progress on this front in the industry more broadly, and I use that term really broadly. All right, so to dive into climate risk, I'll go through this stuff really quickly. I'm sure most of you, you know, many of you wrote the book on this, right? Physical risks, transition risks. On the physical risk side, you've got acute risks: fires, floods, storms, et cetera. And then you have chronic risks: the water's rising, you know, the world's getting hotter, the world's getting wetter in places. And then on the transition risk side, you know, all of the things that human societies do to adapt or to prevent climate change. Have you all seen this chart? Has many of you seen a version of this chart? Maybe not. So this is top chart atmospheric CO2, bottom chart global temperature anomaly. I always think it's important to start a climate conversation with this chart. You know, it doesn't take a, you know, deep statistical expert to understand the relationship between those two lines, right? And B, another thing to notice is that basically all of our human history, now the scale is stretched, but all of our human history is within this little range here, right? So all of our patterns of human settlement, our built environment, our social structures, our cultural traditions have all evolved within this really narrow climatic boundary. And, you know, many of you probably study this. Those assumptions are implicit in a very real way in how we build and what we build, in the thresholds that our buildings and our infrastructure are designed to operate within. Now, you know, we're way the heck out of that range. Not just like, this is the CO2 chart, not just the range that we've been in within the last 10,000 years, but the range we've been in the last like 300, 400,000 years of planetary history, right? So we are entering, just to put the scale, just a kind of completely unprecedented, different environment that's very, you know, hard for the human mind to comprehend the exponential nature of it. Another example of the risks. So this is some work we did with the Woods Hole Research Center. I think they're called Woodwell now, and with Oxford. And you know, this is current frequency of drought. So the darker the red, the higher frequency of drought. I'll just click forward and then back a little bit. 2030. You know, 2050. You can see. You know, I like to cast your eyes towards the Mediterranean, right? You basically see by 2030 and then by 2050, the Mediterranean's in basically a near constant state of drought, right? So, you know, you think about the migration effects, the impact that has on political stability, the impact that'll have on the economies of countries that are, in many cases, you know, largely agricultural or tourism-based. The dislocations are going to be profound, right? This is just one example. You know, we can go through them. You know, we did a big piece of research on climate risk, and one of the things that we found, or the overview of what we found, a few characteristics of climate risk, right? One, it's increasing, and it's increasing in kind of an exponential function in some areas. And we all know from our COVID experience that it's kind of hard for the human mind and for human societies to like grasp the exponential. We're not super good at just understanding the exponential. It's very spatial, and this is important in the context of, you all know this intuitively, but if you think about a bank, right, or an investor, the way that our economic systems are structured don't really take the spatial nature into account, right? So you can trace a dollar through every profit and loss income statement. You know what business unit it comes from. You know what branch it comes from in the bank. You know what the counterparty is. If it's in a real estate asset, you know what the loan to value ratio is of that loan, that dollar that's loaned. But I'll tell you, having done this work with a lot of banks, they have no idea the geographic location of that dollar, right? Like our entire economic system is not spatially aware. And so that's a huge problem with the kind of systemic nature of climate risk, right? It's non-stationary in the sense that, we're not entering a new normal, as some people kind of say. We're entering a centuries in which there will never be a normal, right? Absent some major geoengineering, it's going to continue to shift. It's nonlinear. We talked about the exponential nature of it. It's systemic in the sense that it has cascading impacts across different sectors. It's regressive. It affects the poor the most. And we are just dramatically underprepared for climate risks. And we looked at this, we spent maybe a year and a half, 2 years with a bunch of research partners on this research and looked at a whole bunch of different physical systems, different socioeconomic systems, the physical climate hazards that affect them, the nature of those risks, and just found like a real fragility, a real kind of brittleness in a lot of our built systems, a lot of our spatial distribution of people, and a lot of our economic and social systems. A few examples of this. The one on the left I always find like the heaviest, but there's basically, by 2050, between 700 million and 1.2 billion people that will be living in environments with a 14% annual probability of lethal heat waves. So every year, 14% probability of, this year, and then next year again, and the next year again, 14% annual probability of lethal heat waves affecting almost 1 billion people, or somewhere around 1 billion people. 4 times increased risks of a 15% global grain yield decline. Now this is not, we don't have enough food to feed the world, but this is massive price shocks in the core calorie sources of most of the human population. 4 times capital stock just from riverine flooding that could be affected. 45% of the Earth's surface expected to experience some kind of biome shift. So that's like, rainforest to normal forest, forest to grassland, grassland to desert, or in multiple directions. That's kind of the simplistic view of it. So real profound impacts across a bunch of physical systems. In terms of the nonlinearity of it, I mentioned the lethal heat wave piece, and this chart on the left is, the y-axis is the body temperature, and the x-axis is the amount of time you're exposed to 35°C wet bulb temperature. And 35°C wet bulb is not the same as 35 degrees Celsius. It's a combination of heat and humidity. We haven't really experienced, in places where humans settle, 35°C wet bulb with much frequency in the past, and we're starting to now. I don't know if anyone's noticed the news, but central Pakistan, northern India has started to see these pings of 35°C wet bulb, right, every year, right? You have other parts, even in the southeastern United States, like 35°C wet bulb, 35°C wet bulb. And what happens is, even for a healthy adult human in the shade in a breeze, within about 4 hours exposure to 35°C wet bulb, it's just fatal, right? Now, those of you who know energy systems also know that when you have those types of temperature, you have components of energy systems that have increased risk of failure. You also know that when you have this kind of temperature, you have demand on those energy systems that goes up and leads to higher probability of brownouts. And so this is just one example of the kind of cascading nature of risks. Right, on the right-hand side, the food system one, this is interesting. This is corn. we're in the Midwest, so I won't say maize, but corn. And basically, the reproductive rate of corn is really a sharp peak, right? If you go too much hotter, too much cooler, then you don't get the same growth of that. Now, you see similar dynamics in a lot of our other main grains, that they operate within a certain range, which is why we've come to rely on them as human societies, right? And then physical assets, this is a kind of illustrative chart of, this is a train station. Basically, a little bit of flooding, you get a bit of damage. A bit more flooding, it's a bit worse, it's a bit worse, it's a bit worse. But once you pass a certain threshold, it becomes kind of unsalvageable. And again, y'all are the experts in this, but there's a lot of our buildings that are like that, right? Once you pass a certain threshold, or a lot of our infrastructure that's like that, once you pass a certain threshold, it's a write-off. So from an investor perspective, and I'm not going to say that that all, or even a lot, or most investors are thinking through all these things, but there are a subset of investors that are really staring these things in the eyes and are investing in this, right? And they're seeing in the buildings and infrastructure, they're already seeing these types of effects. You know, I remember having these conversations like 4 or 5 years ago with investors, and you know, of course, the example that would come up would be Florida. And people would say, come on, like, see, you're saying all this stuff, and like Florida's at risk, but look at the real estate prices in Florida. They're up and to the right, up and to the right, up and to the right. Now, the same investors today are like, oh, crap, like, my insurance rates have gone up by, 125%. They continue to accelerate in an exponential way, and they're starting to see the actual fundamental economics of whether it's attractive to own a building be flipped, right? Go over these thresholds, or whether it's attractive to own a piece of infrastructure. Now, that's not everywhere, and we haven't yet seen in Florida, and I'm not picking on Florida, right? I think people understand flood risk more easier than they understand, for example, heat risk, right? But Florida's the easy example. We haven't yet seen, we've seen the insurance prices increase, but we haven't yet seen fiscal solvency be affected. Now, most of Florida's tax base is property taxes, right? These are like thresholds that you can cross that start to have cascading impacts. I'm from Calgary in Canada. A transition risk impact, there was 40% vacancy in downtown Class A office in Calgary for a long time because it's an oil town and the pipeline, the Keystone, wasn't approved, right? And it was a direct transition risk issue. So you're starting to see investors start to wake up to like, this is real, right? We're starting to see these pings on our little dashboards, not that they have dashboards that have pings, but these pings on our metaphoric dashboards where we're seeing this actual impact today. And it's a kind of warning of things to come. Here's one example, just to talk about the materiality. And some of you, might find this interesting because I know a lot of you are working on issues of building resilience and urban resilience. And this is the clear economic case for that from the perspective of the folks that are building and owning those buildings. This is a diversified North American real estate portfolio, commercial real estate. This is really granular modeling we did, like literally flood modeling at a 30 square meter pixel. Heat modeling at I think heat modeling's a less spatial granularity. We looked at the impact of heating degree days and cooling degree days on utility cost based on the envelope of the building. Really, really granular stuff. And we found that, for this investor, it's, between now and 2030, a potential $2 billion at risk in the value of their portfolio. Now, and escalating from there. Now that's relative to kind of a growth. So if it grows, but it'll just grow, it'll grow less, but it still has a big impact on the, whether that chief investment officer or that CEO keeps their job, right? These are really meaningful economic impacts. The interesting thing from an investor perspective, though, is that they're super unevenly distributed, right? So there are a bunch of assets that are actually fine, right? And then there are some assets that are really not fine. And so this is I think the Thales of Miletus point on on climate risk is that smart investors are starting to actually understand these differences in the distribution of risk across their portfolio, and they're starting to do different things as a result of that. One of the things that I think is on the horizon, is a major valuation shock in commercial real estate and residential real estate. Once some of these risks that are already in the system become recognized, once the information becomes recognized by the market. And I think there'll be a handful of prompts of that happening. Any regulatory shifts can prompt that happening. Insurance repricing or withdrawals can prompt that from happening, although the problem with insurance is that it's a lagging indicator because insurance premiums are set annually. So insurers don't have any incentive to tell you what the risk is 5 years from now. They just price it today, right? And they make hay while the sun shines. And then when you have investor demands and revaluations, as investors start to incorporate this into whether they're willing to buy or sell an asset. And then I think the big thing that could cause a major repricing shock is banks, many of whom are doing this climate risk analysis work. They are seeing those kind of charts on their portfolios, and they are trying to figure out how to connect the wires between the analysis they did on risk and the way they price their debt. Now, once banks connect those wires and debt prices change, you'll have a massive impact on the value of a building or a piece of infrastructure, depending on its risk, right? Very sensitive to the cost of debt because all of these assets are highly leveraged. So I think there's on the horizon a potential real shock in the economic system once these things start to become recognized, and there are a bunch of things that can make them recognized. Cool, let me just quickly check the time to make sure I'm tracking. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, so what are smart investors focusing on? First, they're thinking about how they construct their portfolios. So they're figuring, where do I want more or less exposure? What geographies, what kind of assets do I want more or less exposure to? And they're allocating their capital based on that. They're also understanding the cascading impacts of climate risks on other investment drivers. So things like the impacts on migration, the impacts on municipal fiscal solvency, which we talked about, tenancy. They're selecting or not selecting the right assets, and they're figuring out the right price to pay for those assets. They're incorporating it into the way they underwrite. They're improving resilience, especially in development, and there is a real, I think, demand for more sophisticated resilience thinking in the development side. That would be one, maybe ask or invitation, or whatever, of all of you is the resilience thinking in a lot of practical applications that developers are drawing from is pretty crap. To be honest, and needs to be significantly improved. And I think there's a lot of folks probably here who are able to do that. And they're also trying to create value from all the above. So that's on the risk side. Maybe I'll quickly go through the decarbonization side and then close with the kind of agenda for what can be done. So that's all the impacts of the climate on the built environment and how investors are thinking about, okay, how do we understand those impacts? How do we incorporate those in the way we invest and what we demand from our developers, on the construction companies that are building it, et cetera. Now to decarbonization, right? This is one where I think the reality is that, in 2025, there has been a quieting of talk about this, but there's still a lot of work behind the scenes on this topic. Right? It's not like in a lot of these major investors, everyone's just thrown decarbonization out. That's by and large not been the case. Exceptions, of course. You all are probably very well aware of this, or many of you are probably very well aware of this. Very different stories for operational emissions from buildings, heating, cooling, refrigeration, cooking, lighting, et cetera, and the embodied emission in terms of the materials and the construction that goes into the buildings, and the economics of being able to address both. This is a chart that is a mid-rise multifamily building in the United States. Obviously an example, results may vary kind of thing. But in an operational emissions perspective, think of a laser now. So in operational emissions, you can get 72% of the way in terms of emissions reduction from levers that just on their own independently, we're not looking at the intersection between levers on this chart, we'll get there in a sec, are profitable today. There's a huge amount of progress that can be made just with stuff that's on the market today that you can buy, that you can call your general contractor to do. Like this is very possible now. You can get 90% of the way with stuff that we think based on our analysis of supply, scaling, technology improvement, learning rates, et cetera, will be profitable by 2030. And then you can get 97% of the way there by technologies we know the remaining 7% are technologies we know exist, but they're not going to be profitable in the next 10 years, right? But you can get most of the way there with technologies that exist, and most of the way there with technologies that are profitable today. Embodied emissions, very different story, right? You can only get a little bit of the way there. This is like some design tweaks and some materials on the outside and so on that you can make. Many of you do this research. And then, by 2030, you can get almost 40% of the way there. Much of where we need to go on the embodied emission side is either we don't have the technologies yet or we don't have the economics yet. And so this is where I think the embodied emission side, this is where I think a lot of, or the thing that is going to help us progress is research, right? Is invention, is actually prototyping, developing, trying to scale these new technologies. That's many of your jobs, so I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the top one, which I know best, which is on the operational side, we need to deploy, right? These are a few examples. The main message here is that, so basically the black bubbles here are when you kind of add up the levers independently and don't really think of them in an intersected way. And if you look at the actual practice of building management, the way many investors run their buildings and hire contractors and do facilities management, it's done in the same way that it was done in like 1950, right? You've got like a person in the building and they're saying we need to replace this at end of life, and so we'll replace this, and then there's another thing that comes up later, and then we need to do a renovation on this year, so we'll do a couple extra things there. It really isn't very sophisticated, honestly, the practice of actually operating and renovating, upgrading buildings. And so the black bubbles are the NPV, the net present value, so the kind of return on investment of where you'd get if you do it that way. In many of these cases we've seen, and these are all very real examples, the top one's a big retailer, the second one is a university, and the bottom two are real estate investors. With almost all of them, we've seen them able to get to basically a neutral NPV of full net zero with really, really conservative assumptions. So I won't go into this too much, but if there's any kind of real estate nerds, it's basically just the savings on the utility bill are the only benefit that's modeled in this. There's no assumption that the tenant's going to pay more to rent in your building. It's super, super conservative. Once you layer on some of those assumptions, which many of these real estate investors are doing, then you get to really a profitable way of decarbonizing. So I think the overall message here the overall message here is, from operational emissions perspective, with today's technologies, today's supply chain, we can profitably, with positive return on investment, decarbonize most of our buildings like now, today. I think this is a super hopeful story. But as many of you know, the way that the intelligence we have around buildings is really poor, right? There's so many different buildings out there. Most people don't know what's in them. The way we do energy audits is really antiquated, in the sense that you have someone manually go into a building and check all the different systems and so on. And it's not allowing us to find those buildings that have the highest return on investment from upgrading them, from decarbonizing them. And as a result, there's a whole bunch of buildings out there that are just continuing to emit at the same level they were before, because no one has realized that we can reduce those emissions in a profitable way. So there's a market clearing issue here, right? There's an informational gap in the market. There are now, well, maybe I'll go back one sec. I think, you know, we've done a lot of work here, and there are others that are doing work here. But the question is, like, how do we solve that problem? How can we modernize the energy audit approach so that we understand what's in buildings and we can more quickly, efficiently identify those buildings that have the highest potential to be renovated, to be upgraded, to reduce the emissions? And the bottom line here, some of you may do some of this as work as well. There's a lot of technology and data out there now that makes this possible, right? So there are now satellite images of buildings that look at the infrared, the infrared footprint, the heat footprint of the building. You can kind of tell how leaky the envelope is if you correlate that with local weather. And we have that data on local weather at a local weather station level. There's all these energy models of buildings that you can train machine learning on to understand the real detailed energy dynamics of a building. We know subsurface soil conductivity for ground source heat pump potential. We can use satellite imaging to understand the pitch of a rooftop, the available space on the rooftop, and we know the local solar radiation, so we know solar potential. We can use visual recognition to see the distribution systems on the rooftop, whether there's an RTU. We can tell a lot of things about a building without having to go on the rooftop with the tape measure. And so I think we need to fundamentally modernize the way we think about understanding buildings and the way we think about distributing information about those buildings to the folks who have the incentives to upgrade them and to reduce their emissions. It's super accurate, right? We've compared this with folks that have done multi-month studies of buildings, and the AI kind of approach, and this is old school machine learning AI, none of this new fancy Gen AI stuff, right? Like this is machine learning, and it's super accurate. It's really accurate. It's accurate at a building level, and it's, if you imagine the value of doing it on 1,000 buildings in a portfolio, or on 10,000 buildings in a city, or we've done it on a university campus, it just changes it from being a multi-months or multi-year expensive effort to something that can be done in weeks. So I think I'm really hopeful about the operational side of things. I think we just need to start changing the system and doing things fundamentally different. It's a change management issue. It's an industry change issue. It's a science issue. And we kind of need to get after it. So what can be done? I'll just leave with a few thoughts on kind of what we were observing around the system. So on the resilient side, I think a few things we need to do to accelerate here, right? One is we need to just improve our analysis. There is a lot of these, frankly, risk analysis firms out there. Some are great, some are super not great in terms of the climate risk analysis they do. We need to get way better at the sophistication of the risk analysis. And that exists, but the analysis needs to be granular in space. I think a 1 square mile pixel for flood modeling is as good as useless, in my opinion, to be provocative, right? You can imagine the topography that can exist in many cities over a square mile, right? It needs to be probabilistic and honest about that so people know how to use it, how to interpret results, because every time we don't make it probabilistic, we discredit the science. And it needs to be quantified in terms of its actual impact on a building or a piece of infrastructure or a city. We need to unblock, this is maybe a bit more of a controversial one, we need to unblock signal obstruction. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of players in the system that have an incentive not to see the risks. And there are not many players in the system that have an incentive to see the risks. And I think what we're doing is we're kicking the can down the road, and the bubble is inflating as we do so, because those risks aren't being made visible. And so I think it's better that we create we find ways to know earlier rather than later what the risks of a place are. It will be painful. There will be disruptions. We need to manage those. It will be worse if we wait. And we need to democratize that risk awareness. It's not right that a major bank or a major investor can understand really granular risks as they have the ability to invest in those and understand them, but a first-time home buyer can't, right? Someone who's putting their whole financial situation on, one asset. They don't really have access to the same information. There's some stuff which is great that's starting to happen on, Zillow or Redfin. There is some work there, but we need to really accelerate that. On the sustainability side, we need to clear the market. I talked about that. We need to create radical transparency of building conditions so that we can match the people who want to upgrade them and the people who would benefit from them being upgraded. We need to scale supply, create some forward-looking view of the demand so that the heat pump manufacturers, and we talked about labor this morning, the states that can do upskilling and reskilling can invest in those programs because they know there will be a demand for them. We need to create transparency into embodied carbon. This is a big issue that basically the people in the system that have the incentive to reduce emissions reduce emissions in general, embodied carbon is not showing up on their carbon accounting, right? The local, with all respect to local contractors, the local mom and pop GC, general contractor, they don't really have much incentive to reduce the emissions of the steel associated with their construction, or the local developer. It's the pension fund or the bank that buys that building after two owners that does. And so we need to make sure that embodied emissions are conveyed so there's appropriate incentive on the system to address embodied carbon. And then we need to innovate. I think that's what a lot of you are doing, innovate in designs and methods and materials. And we need to unblock the adoption barriers for those innovations. The heterogeneity of local zones and codes and permitting regulations has killed untold numbers of clean cement and cross-laminated timber and green steel startups or new methods. It is just like completely destroying the ability of these innovations to be adopted. And that's a critical thing to address, or we're not going to actually allow the technologies and the business models that can decarbonize embodied carbon to scale. All right, I'll stop there. I think overall, I think there is a lot of hope. There's a lot of progress happening here. There's a lot to do. So yeah, happy to take questions.
Wow, so very, very interesting talk. So I cannot keep my eye out of this one. So just trying to see all the slides from there. I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of questions from our audience here. So can you pass the microphone? Okay, great.
Thank you. Look, terrific. Absolutely terrific. Can I just refer to your LinkedIn site? So your PhD was on how cities and other complex human systems can overcome the inertia of their legacies to meet current challenges. E.g., how can we fundamentally transform a Rust Belt city to be prosperous and sustainable? So in your unblocking the adoption blockers, what likelihood of success can you see in the next, let's say in our lifetime, that we're going to see some of the permits and codes and technologies and local and state and federal governments actually opening or unblocking these blockers?
That's awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, please do not look up my dissertation. I have a bit of optimism, recently gained optimism on the permitting and the codes stuff. At least this is maybe a bit more of a US-centric view. But I mean, I don't know if anyone's seen all the hurrah about Ezra Klein's Abundance book. And there's become, I'm in DC, and there's been like a really rapid and interesting kind of alignment of forces around addressing the permitting issue. So you have everyone from the Business Roundtable, which is like the main group of American CEOs, to a lot of more left think tanks and journalists and reporters all say we need to address the absurdity of this permitting thing. We're going to publish an article in a few weeks about this as well. So I think at least on the federal permitting side, there's some momentum there. I think it's going to be a thing to try and coordinate all the local and state level stuff. That's probably a generational challenge, right? Like or challenge that would last a generation. But I think there's been a fair amount of progress, at least on like the federal side, and there's some stuff at the state level. And then, yeah, I don't know that. So yeah, the second thing I was going to say. So that's on the permitting side, and then I don't know. My sense about this is like we got to kind of make progress where we can, and that's why I'm always emphasizing the operational emissions reduction, because that I'm super optimistic about. We've just seen it so many times that the economics work, but people are still surprised, right, by it. So I think there's a huge amount of progress we can make there, and if we think about 2030 targets, like that's a huge piece of it. Thank you for the question and the research. Yeah. Yeah.
If there was one incentive that you could incorporate tomorrow to get there faster, what would that be?
Are we off the record here? I mean, a price on carbon, but if I have to incorporate one, I would say a price on carbon. That hasn't worked out so well in my home country of Canada of late, but that would certainly be one. I mean, another would just be the transparency piece, I think, making sure that there's full value chain transparency of, like, especially in the built environment, there's a lot of contractors that don't even know whether they're getting electric arc furnace steel or blast furnace steel. And so there's actually not a demand signal that's being conveyed then up the value chain to provide more of the clean stuff. And so I think if we create a transparency and traceability of emissions, like all the way through the life cycle, then there are enough folks that are doing this for their own reasons that would start to create the demand signal. Yeah, thank you.
Brody, thanks a lot for that presentation. Very interesting indeed, just like Sogan mentioned. So, I think in your last answer, you probably touched upon it, but whenever we're talking about sustainability, often the circularity comes into question, and with circularity comes into question the issue of supply chain.
Yeah.
So when you talk about, operational reductions and embodied reductions, what are some of the assumptions that you have considered? And also, my second part of that question would be, based on the research that you all have done, what is the economics for circularity that you see that will promote, more sustainable supply chain in process?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Really interesting. On the circularity piece, some of my colleagues just published a report on this as well. In terms of the first part of your question around the assumptions, all of the assumptions that we take into here, we try and be absurdly conservative about them. So zero circularity assumptions in this, especially in those operational emissions reductions. The reason for that is, like, we always have to stand in front, and I have to do this all the time, stand in front of a board of directors of like skeptical real estate investors and talk about climate. And I always want to go in and be able to say, like, who cares about this climate stuff? Like, we're just focused on the return on investment, and we're not looking at any crazy green premium stuff or any, so we try and be super, in terms of the assumption part, we try and be super, super, super conservative. In the second part of your question on the kind of business case, if I got it right, the business case for circularity. And the supply chain side of that, I mean, I think this is, my understanding is this is, I'm not a super deep expert on the material circularity side of things, but my understanding is it's still very, very nascent. Like you have both the reuse part, like the collection part of the circularity supply chain, and then the ability to like reprocess materials are both impaired by the fact that the built environment ecosystem is just so fragmented, right? And you have a lot of the work being done by local contractors who, again, to the earlier point, like don't necessarily, they're trying to make their business survive for another 6 months, you know, in many cases, unless you're a big infrastructure developer. I know you saw some of them, that's a different story, but yeah, I think the circularity is still very, very early days. Like we've seen some of it on things like the kind of lower mass materials that come out of a building when you're doing a renovation and taking like siding and windows and heat pump, well, they wouldn't be heat pumps, but like, you know, former heating cooling systems and recycling some of like the base materials back into the supply chain. I think we've seen some progress with that because it addresses some of the transportation challenges of the heavier materials. But yeah, I think it's still like super early days on the circularity side. Any other questions, comments, challenges?
Well, I have a few more if nobody else is asking questions. All right, so let me ask another question. You mentioned during your presentation about super reduction in utility bills, and that being one of the ways of achieving low carbon emissions and so on. So again, I presume your assumption is solar power in cutting the utility bills, or renovating this old systems into new systems perhaps so that are more energy efficient. But again, my question comes back to the financial viability for an individual homeowner in converting from a regular system to a solar system. Presently, I don't see that there's a value proposition. So your comments, please.
Yeah, so this, to be clear, like it's a good question. Like the charts that I was showing, they're all commercial. They're all commercial buildings. So none of those include single family residential. That is definitely a different story. The way that you get to the positive ROI is, I mean, technically speaking, it's an electrification measures. So it's, you know, heat pump replacements, et cetera. It's a bunch of efficiency measures. You know, heat pumps is one of them, but also LEDs, you know, all the kind of classic stuff. There's, in some cases, envelope work that's done to improve efficiency. We found often in commercial buildings, refrigeration systems are massive sources of waste. Heat recovery opportunities associated with refrigeration, leak management associated with refrigeration, building energy management systems that, you know, modulate demand based on when it's being used and so on. And then yes, where feasible, things like rooftop solar to kind of supplement the energy generation. Now, you know, many of you do the building science on this, right? So you know this better than I, but the problem with how it's done currently is each of those levers is kind of a separate project, often, done at a separate time, and designed independently. And this is what some of the machine learning enables the recognition of. You still need an engineer to do the design and, you know, sign the drawing, but is looking at the full energy system of a building and choosing and sequencing those measures in a way that takes into account all of the other measures. So the classic example being, you know, envelope before electrify, right? If you improve the envelope, you need a smaller heat pump, you need smaller, you know, less ducting upgrades, you need less panel upgrades. That sounds obvious. It's not frickin' done in most of the buildings that are out there, right? Because of the way that these buildings are managed and the way that portfolios are managed. It's not done. And so that is where you get those interdependencies between levers that leads to far more significant efficiency improvements and far better cost reductions. It's the interdependence of all the measures. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's one here too, yeah. Oh, sorry, did you have one? Yeah.
Thanks, it was a very nice presentation. I do research in facility management,
Yeah.
and a recurring theme with us is always, how do we get into the board?
To the board.
Yeah, how do we get to the strategic level? And we had some discussion yesterday that facility management is often viewed at the operational level. And then when I see this aspect, I see that there is kind of potential for things to happen. But if it's reliant and if facility management is being viewed only at the operational level, it's hard to kind of start to influence things at the strategic level and get these things moving.
100%. And what we often say in this is that this is a boiler room to boardroom approach, and both of those things need to be true. And I think the problem is, on the one hand, to your point, too often building operations is seen as, those are the operators, like, they'll tell us if something breaks, right? But also, too often, there's sustainability plans or decarbonization plans or just plain capital plans that are done at the boardroom that aren't actually based on the physical state of the buildings. And in our view, those aren't as good as the paper they're written on, because if they're not actually based on the physical realities of buildings, they're fake numbers, right? And so the way that we've been able to kind of convert to the boardroom, I would say a few things. One is just scale. You get to the boardroom if you're able to aggregate the facility management plans effectively across 500 buildings or 1,000 buildings, because then instead of talking about an HVAC upgrade, you're talking about a $1 billion capital allocation, right? That's a boardroom topic. So one is scale. Now that scale requires the different methods, because you need to be able to have the plans for each of the buildings and be able to aggregate them effectively, which is part of the problem with the way it's done today, right? So that's one of it. The other is just the way that we do the messaging and who we talk to and all that kind of stuff. But 100% agree, and that I think needs to shift.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, so let me continue that conversation. So very, very good question, and I wanted to pick up on that. We have done a lot of research in what are the perturbations and the impact of perturbations, the win-win strategies that insurance, reinsurance companies can use to not only invest in infrastructure redevelopment, but also at the same time reduce the implication to them if there were to be a disaster or a damage to the building. One point that I wanted to raise was that many universities in this country have an extensively large deferred maintenance, millions of dollars of deferred maintenance. Now, these are definitely energy guzzling buildings, right? With such a huge deferred maintenance, there needs to be some strategy that would lower the impact on institutions such as large universities to be able to take on that investment, right? You mentioned boardroom billion-dollar investment, but I don't see that insurance companies or reinsurance companies are providing that incentive that would allow these kind of rapid development so that we can actually meet the goals in 2040. So your thoughts on what you have seen in your work?
Yeah, agreed. Maybe a couple things. One is, I think there are problems in the way insurance is done because insurance is often not done in a way that takes into account the physical nature of the building, and so doesn't incentivize adaptation, and resilience improvements, right? That's not how the policies are underwritten. And in some cases, that is a matter of regulatory obstacles. Because there are some states and jurisdictions in which you can't, if you're going to play in that state, you need to insure everyone. And so there's not an incentive, and so that's why you've seen insurers withdraw from some states. There's not an incentive to really take into account the adaptation at an individual building level in the way the policy is priced. So part of that is a regulatory issue. Part of that is just a practice and capability issue, with insurers not necessarily having the sophistication of tools to do that. So I think there is certainly an insurance part of that equation. There are innovations happening there, like maybe some of you are tracking kind of like, I think it's parametric insurance, which pays a certain, it kind of flips that on its head by saying, we'll pay you just a certain amount if the flood goes above 72 centimeters, right? And then it becomes a incentive of the building owner to say, well, they're not just gonna pay me for the damages, but if I reduce the damages of my building, I'm still gonna get the same payout. And so there's a bit more of an incentive to invest in adaptation. So I think part of it is that, like there are some innovations happening there that I think are promising. The other piece here is the banks. The banks are, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with banks that are all excited about starting like a green loan program, but they haven't been able to get out of their own way, right? In terms of actually pricing these things in a way that takes advantage of adaptation measures, takes advantage of sustainability. And so what it ends up being is a marketing like stamp on a fundamentally similarly priced debt to the building. And so again, there's no incentive. There's one innovation that I think is an interesting one in Canada, where the Canadian Infrastructure Bank has partnered with the Bank of Montreal to offer sub-priced debt that allows for investments in efficiency and so on. So hopefully we'll see more like that. I think, was there a question at the table behind you, Mark? No, don't be diplomatic. Don't be diplomatic.
Okay, all right. Well, firstly, thank you for sharing with us who actually runs the world, being banks, insurers, etc. I'm just asking, there was some mention of regulation and control here, but what do you see the actual influence of elected governments actually within this space? Who's actually holding the cards and the power here? Is it going to have to come from the banks and the insurers and the investors? Because there was a lot of that map where there were a lot of people that are going to be suffering as a result of our humanity thus far, and I'm not laying blame for that anywhere in particular. But I think it's fascinating that we've had this presentation. And yes, I understand why because of that, but I'm asking, where do you think the sort of influence of actual elected governments, and how much do they actually realistically have in this space now, given where we are and how global economics works?
Yeah, good question.
That's why you didn't want me to ask it.
No. I'm glad you did. We have seen. I would take a global perspective on the answer to that question, and I think where you do have elected governments that have taken meaningful action on this front, you have seen significant private sector response to that action. And that's why people now, almost as a cliche, say, oh, well, sustainability is still a thing in Europe, right? It's because you do have elected governments who are taking action, right? So I think that's a very geographically variable situation. Same thing in Canada, where I'm from, right? Prime Minister Carney just withdrew the consumer carbon tax, kept the industrial carbon tax. But that carbon tax had an enormous impact, and the industrial carbon tax still has an enormous impact on private sector action. So I think there's a huge amount of effect there. Other things that have had a meaningful effect in the United States, in the last administration, the SEC rule, the Securities and Exchange Commission rule. Banks, investors, as kind of powerful as they seem, an SEC rule is like a frickin' veto card, right? You will have to disclose this to the market, right? And immediately, even though that was going through a bunch of litigation, even before it ever took shape, you saw a vast amount of changes happen in investors and banks and others, just in the potential that rule took effect, right, in terms of their reporting, their action on decarbonization. So I think, elected governments are critical. The question is, who are we electing, and are they effective, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, just thank you so much, Roddy. So we have a token of appreciation for your time, the interesting talk for us. So we were so happy to have you here. Hope that you come back more to Purdue. So we learn a lot, and the same. And just a last note, I think that this is the global issue, global effort. And then now having everyone from all around the world, I think that all of us are responsible to take one step toward achieving what was mentioned in the presentation. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Suzanne.
Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Awesome.
Dr. Hashtag has a few comments.
All right, good morning, everybody. Just a few items for today. First of all, we have a number of sessions lined up right after this keynote presentation. The lunch is going to be here today, so please plan to be here as we also go through the closing ceremony. And right after the closing ceremony, we're having the Global Leadership Forum starts at 2 o'clock. And you all are welcome to attend. Just to give you a quick background on what this is about. So about 15 years ago, we started a group of senior professors and leaders in the programs that are running their construction programs or architectural programs to come together to talk about common issues that relate to program development, relate to administration, relate to research, relate to whatever other service activities. And so that's the group. So if you feel you are part of that group and should be there, you're welcome to attend. Also, there's a group for young leaders. So you're aspiring to be in an administrative position and a leadership position, there's a space for you as well. So that is going to be today, starting at 2 o'clock. I believe it's on the second floor. You can check the room in the app. And that is going to run today and all day tomorrow. So if you're here tomorrow as well, that'll be great. There are a number of panel discussions and keynotes also scheduled for that. So we look forward to seeing you all at that event. Thank you.